Good evening. My name is Jill Lilly. I am part of the leadership team for ACAP Center County. And we are very happy to have a presentation tonight on hospice and anticipatory grief, which I think you'll find very helpful. Before we get into introductions, I would like to thank our core sponsors. We would not be here if we did not have their financial support. So that would include Foxdale Village, Penn State Health, Juniper, the Center County Office of Aging, Grain Hospice, and Encompass Health. So today's sponsor is Koch Funeral Home. We are very, very grateful for all of the support that we get. For those of you here in person, please check out our resource table. There's information there, including upcoming events that you might find interesting. And we hope that those of you who are listening at home through Zoom, we hope that you consider coming in person in a future presentation. We would love to see faces back here again. Since COVID, we've not had that opportunity. So if you have any questions during the presentation and you're watching virtually, please put those questions in chat, and we will get back to you. If you have any other questions about ACAP, please go to www.acapcommunity.org, and you'll find a plethora of information, including podcasts there that you might find helpful. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Jackie Hook and Holly Reigh, and I will let them tell you a little bit about us.
Thank you, Jill. Thank you for having us here tonight to talk about hospice and anticipatory grief. I don't know where everybody's coming from, zooming in or on the internet, but if it's like where we are, it's a beautiful day. So coming to have a conversation about hospice and anticipatory grief takes a lot of courage. So we want to acknowledge that right up front. As Jill said, my name is Jackie Nittany Hook, and I am a spiritual director, a celebrant, and an end-of-life doula. My work is about companioning people around dying, death, and grief. And these conversations are difficult to have, but they can make such a difference in people's lives. I always say we have these kinds of conversations not in a morbid kind of way, but in a seize the day kind of way, and then live more fully now. It's by paying attention to these things that it helps us to live more fully now. There's a wisdom tale from Madagascar that the creator came to the first man and woman and said, you have a choice. You can live and die like the moon, or you can live and die like the banana tree. And the first man and woman said, what's the difference? And the creator said, if you live like the banana tree, you'll grow and create and have offspring, and then you'll wither away and die. If you live like the moon, you'll wax and wane, but you'll never fully die. And the couple thought about it and said, we want to live like the banana tree. And the moral is that it's because we're able to create and love and experience life that brings the meaning to it. And so these kinds of conversations are really significant. It always seems when we're going to have a conversation like this, something happens in our lives that speaks to this. And I got a phone call Sunday night from my sister that my mom's best friend since sixth grade, first day of sixth grade, so I think we figured that's 77 or 78 years they've been best friends, was in the hospital and not doing very well. And I had the opportunity to schedule a phone call for my mom and her friend yesterday and witness that call. And there's lots of anticipatory grief, right? Because they know what's coming. But the two of them were laughing and giggling on that phone call and helped me understand, even in a deeper way, how it's important to really be present in the moment. And I think that speaks a lot to what we want to do today, is talk about being present, being intentional, and taking these experiences for all that they are and all that they can be and all that they can teach us and transform us. So we recognize your courage. The root of the word courage is core, which means heart. So what we invite you to do is to be present and open to your hearts tonight as we have these important conversations. Do you want to say a little bit about who you are?
Sure, yes. So my name is Reigh, and my background is I am a nurse. I worked hospice for about 12, 13 years. And so I didn't come to hospice willingly, actually. When I was in school, the one thing I didn't want was to work hospice. And that's the one place that I was called to. So since then, I've transitioned into, like Jackie, I'm the life doula. And I'm a patient advocate. I got certification as a professional aging life care professional. That's what I do. So what I do is advocate and navigate people through the healthcare system. And sometimes I get phone calls based on a crisis, or those phone calls where they just want some planning, or there's family members that are out of town, just whatever it might be. And like Jackie, we've been together now for a while. We should probably count that up sometime, how long we've been working together. But like Jackie, yesterday I got a phone call and a friend was in the hospital, and she had back surgery a couple of weeks ago, and she ended up back in the hospital with some major complications and actually an infection. And during situations like that, they need a voice. And so I got the phone call to help advocate for her, navigate the system, and be her voice, because she's emotionally tired. She's in a lot of pain. And so that's what we do, or I do. And so together, between Jackie and I, we provide this service where we focus on end of life. And I do a lot of the pre-planning, setting up the process, getting people ready, having those conversations. And so that's what brings us here today. I always like to say, death happens, let's talk. And that actually happened to me a couple of weeks ago. I was in California, and I had the opportunity to sit with a lady at end of life, where in California, it is death with dignity. So you are allowed, if you have a diagnosis of 6 months or less, where the doctor can prescribe you some medication, and you're able to take that when you want to, where you want to. And, I'm still I take a lot of, emotion from that. Some days I'm like, wow, this was wow. And then other days I'm like, I don't know. So it has me really thinking, and it also has me really thinking as to how to educate people and have this conversation. And then it also has me looking at death too. It's so different for different people. And it depends on how old you are. It depends on the diagnosis. And so that's what we're here to talk about. And I'll start it off with hospice, if you're good with that, and all the anticipatory grief that comes with that. Because with this lady in California, there was a lot of anticipatory grief that was occurring, and everybody was experiencing something a little different. And it came in waves. People were laughing. There was times of crying. There was times of, sadness. But this lady had a diagnosis, and she wanted to, pick and choose the time. And her mom was there, and her mom didn't agree with it. And she was grieving in a totally different way than what her best friend was. And to watch that and have that privilege of being there, and even just there were sections of the house and the outside area that were sort of fenced off. So if you were grieving this type of way, and you wanted to have like sadness, the person wanted people further away from her. So you had to go on one side of the yard. But if you wanted to be like embracing it and, you know, talking to her, then there was a different section. So even in that environment, they staged the area based on how everyone was grieving with their anticipatory grief. And so all of that kind of folds into like hospice, and how I got started with it is just that scary, ugly word that no one wants to talk about. And there's a lot of myths that go behind hospice. And, you know, sometimes it's okay. You know, people are okay with that. Sometimes they're not. But some of the myths have to do with hospice is, you know, like once I'm on hospice, I have to stay on hospice. That's a myth. Just because you get admitted doesn't mean that you have to stay. You can be discharged off for many different reasons, and, you know, having those conversations. And then that's what we do. You know, we help people have those conversations. A myth is that hospice is 24 hours, 7 days a week care. That's a myth. No hospice agency will provide that level of care. And many times the families need us to support them throughout that process, because again, hospice can't be there all the time. So we can fill those gaps with hospice. Hospice does pay for a lot of equipment, because typically if you're over 65 and you have an improved diagnosis, there's a lot of items that are going to be paid for. So for example, the service itself is paid for at 100%. Some of the equipment can be paid for at 100%. So not that we want to make this about money, but if there's a financial strain with families, sometimes that's what they need, because like a hospital bed will be paid for if there needs to be oxygen. So again, other type of supplies, if there's a wound. So it's, again, let's talk. Let's have a conversation about what's approved, what's not approved. And now hospice goes wherever the home is. It can be at a facility. It can be at your home. It can be at a family member's home. Hospice meets you where you're at. So once again, it's having those conversations. And sometimes it's hard to bring that up too. How do you have that conversation? How do you open that up? And I always like to use the word sprinkle. That comes a lot with people. It's not like you sit down at the Thanksgiving meal and say, all right, Mom, you know, let's talk about what happens when you're going to die. Like, you don't do it quite like that. But how I talk to people is like, look at opportunities. If there's a situation that occurs in the community, or it's a friend that maybe they got ill, like Jackie just mentioned with her mom and things, that's an opportunity to have that conversation. Hey, Mom, you know, you had this conversation with your friend, this happened. In a situation like that, what would you like, Mom? You know, and have those conversations, because that does a lot for the people that will continue to live. And that's a gift that you can give them. You can give them that gift of conversation. So they're not guessing when they're so emotional. They don't need to guess, because you told them what they want. And you'll offer them a level of peace because you've told them what they want. And that's what they want to do. They want to honor you. So making sure you have those conversations. And yes, there's a question in the room. Go for it. Thank you.
Is hospice, does it have to be prescribed by a physician, or can you just say, obviously you just can't say I want it and it happens, but.
Right. Yes. You need to have an order to have hospice, and you can talk to your PCP. If you're seeking a specialist can write that order too. And once again, if you need help navigating that, that's what we do. I help people navigate it, understand, and where do we go to get that order. Sometimes doctors, maybe it's your family doctor and they're not real comfortable with that. That's okay. There's other avenues to get that diagnosis. Hospice agencies can help as well. So there's a couple different ways to get that order. And that's why I'm an advocate. I don't just stop. Like, I kind of just say, all right, well, there's a roadblock. Do we go around it? Do we go under it? Do we go over it? But one way or another, we're gonna get through that. And so it takes some time, but that's what we do, is, you know, getting people ready and preparing for that. And during that process, that's where anticipatory grief comes in. And you'll experience, like I said, I often think of it as the ocean waves. Like when you're sitting at the ocean, the waves come in, and sometimes they come in calm, and it's just real refreshing. And that's how grief is. And then out of the blue, sometimes there's this big wave comes, and you're like, where did that wave come from? And grief is like that too. You could be walking along, and all of a sudden there's a smell, there's a sound that will trigger you back to a moment, a memory. And it could be sad, it could be happy, there could be laughter. And there's no right or wrong way to grieve. And we just all have to accept that, that's where we're at, and we are grieving, and it does come and go. And so
You want to share about sitting in a doctor's office trying to wait for an order?
Yes. And that's where I think I realized that people needed to have some support. And that's I remember that. So there was a lady that wanted hospice, and she was appropriate for her. It was appropriate for her, but we needed an order. Like it was asked, yeah, you do need to have an order. So I was able to go into the doctor's office, and we weren't able to get the order. But what I ended up doing was I was handing out like pens and things and brochures, because at that time I was working with a hospice agency, and on the door it said no soliciting. So I was handing out information and talking to everybody, and they mentioned, you can't solicit here. I was like, that's okay. You can arrest me, because what great PR to say that a hospice nurse was arrested for advocating for her clients. Like, okay, that's like great marketing. And they didn't think that was as funny as I did, but I did get the order, and it wasn't done nicely. It was thrown at me, but I humbly just scooped it up and, did what I needed to do, because it wasn't about me. And the work that I do is never about me. I don't judge. And so that was, And that's really where it came full circle to me, is that, there's a lot of pre-planning that needs to be done, and a lot of conversations that need to happen before we're even at the hospice point. And I do a lot of work with solo agers. So that is somebody that has never been married, or they're no longer married, either by divorce or death, and their children aren't involved for whatever reason. Maybe it's because of geographic area. Maybe they never had children. Their children have passed, but I help them, navigate and work them through any type of situation they have as they age.
So what Holly's talking about really takes us into this concept. And if you want to go to the next page of the booklet, for those of you here, the concept of death nesting. Mm-hmm. And I think that is a great image to have to think about the dying process. You want to create a nest. So the outside of the nest has some hard, firm sticks and things like that, right, to protect. The same is true when you're death nesting for someone. You want to do the things that Holly's talking about. You want to get hospice in place. You want to have the conversations. You want to have that structure in place so that the individual and the family, the loved ones, can be held, and then they can be in the soft part of the nest. In terms of the structure, as end-of-life doulas, we have 3 phases that we work with. The first one is summing up and planning. And Holly's talking about the planning. Again, those are the sticks and the mud on the outside. Summing up, we like to talk about meaning, legacy projects. We like to talk about rugs, regrets, unfinished business, guilt, and shame. The idea is to be very intentional. You might be afraid to have these kinds of conversations, but it's my experience, and Holly, you can let me know what you think. But yes, there are often tears, but there is so much love shared during those times too, and important things are talked about. Conversations that you might never have if you don't create the space to do it. As a celebrant, I sit with families usually after a death and talk about the loved one's life and take all kinds of notes and then create a service, send it to them, they edit it, and then I officiate at the service. And one time I was working with a family, and the wife was dying, but she wanted to meet with me to plan her funeral. So they invited me to their house, and I rang the doorbell, and they opened the door. The husband opened the door and ushered me into the living room and said, my wife will be joining us shortly. And a little bit later, she came walking out, dragging her oxygen tank, very frail. And she sat down on the couch, and we started to talk about her life. I asked her questions about her family, what mattered to her. She showed me books her kids had created for them for the anniversary. She told me that every day, at the end of the day, she created a list of what she had to do the next day. And the last item on every list was create tomorrow's list. We had this conversation for about an hour and a half. And at the end of it, she looked at me and she said, that was fun. And I thought, wow, we just planned your funeral. And you said that was fun, because we talked about what mattered to her. We talked about what brought meaning to her life. And these are the kinds of conversations that you can have as you're building the outer part of that nest. And then it helps to hold everybody in that nest.
So what's your thoughts though too? Like, people plan, and anybody has any comments, you plan graduations, you plan birthdays, you plan retirements, you plan your vacation. Like, why not plan death? Why don't we do that?
Because we're afraid of it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes we feel like, gosh, if I think about that, I'm going to realize I haven't lived the life I wanted to live, you know?
That's true. I actually talked to a lady once where she said that. She's like, if I talk about it, it'll happen faster.
People are afraid it'll come more quickly if
Yeah.
you talk about it. Yeah.
So,
Yeah. So they're real reasons. They're afraid it's going to upset family members,
Mhm.
right?
Okay.
They're afraid it's going to cause, dysfunction in the family. People are going to, you can share stories about seeing that, right? With
Right.
the one family and the sticky notes.
Yes. Yeah. Because that happened actually where a lady was passing away in her home, and there's children that popped in, and they were putting sticky notes on items that they wanted. And she hadn't died yet. And, in that moment too, I know that people can sense when somebody's around. They always say, can they hear me? I can't say for sure that they can understand every single word, but they do sense something, and they can hear, because, you could tell from her, just her demeanor and things. And then oftentimes too, people have asked if somebody's holding on at end of life, like, why? And we're going to talk to them and say, all right, how have you been here? Have you been sitting by their bedside? Because if you don't give them a break, they may not want to die when you're present. So we're talking to them and saying, all right, listen, for 20 minutes, like every hour for 20 minutes, say to your loved one, listen, I'm going to go for a cup of coffee. I'm going to go for a walk. It's okay to leave. I'm going to be okay. And that's back to this pre-planning and building that outer nest, having those conversations with your loved one before, so they know what their wishes are, will allow them to pass and let go, because they know that it has been planned and you're going to be okay. So that's another value of having these conversations, is because it's not like if it's going to happen, it's when. Like, that's something we can't stop. So talk about it. And words, like, I wish I could do more with that, but for some reason, like, that's when we're always called in. I can't say always, but we're probably 70% of the time is more of a crisis situation where help, I can't do this alone.
Yeah. There was one family I worked with during COVID, and so we met virtually. And every time we met, you could tell that the couple saved the conversations till that time, so that they could talk about it. Because it's hard to have these kinds of conversations, and you're worried about the other one.
Right.
What mattered most to the husband was that his wife was going to be okay. What mattered most to the wife was that he wasn't going to suffer. So being very intentional about it. And that brings us to the second phase of the doula work, and that's planning and holding the vigil. So being very intentional about the actual active dying time. And of course, we're talking about when we have a prognosis, right? And we know they're dying. All deaths don't occur like that. But talking about where you want to be, who you want to be there. Do you want to have music playing? How do you want people to touch you? Some of us like to be rubbed, others of us don't. How do you want people to interact with you? I know of a person who asked that everybody take off their shoes before they entered the space where they were dying, and that they think about a memory as they enter and talk to the dying individual about those memories. I worked with a family where the patriarch wanted to have letters from his grandchildren read to him as he was actively dying. Families who are that intentional will use words with us like magical and deeply spiritual, the whole process. It doesn't have to be. It can be a scary, hard. I mean, there are those moments, right? But there can be a lot of beauty in it too. I've read where our impression of death came from the Black Plague in Europe. And people thought if they drew pictures of skulls and crossbones and wore them on their bodies, that death would think they were already dead. And so death wouldn't come to them. And so that idea came to the States as well. And so we have these dark, scary images, but it doesn't have to be. I mean, you can tell lots of stories, right, about people looking to the corner of the room and seeing loved ones and feeling loved. And so it's really about paying attention to that. And you can start doing that now, even if this is not something that's imminent for you. Thinking about it, it really helps you think about how you want to live your life now. And then we're talking about anticipatory grief over and over again. And it's so important to remember that that's normal. We all feel that anticipatory grief. And in some cases, they've found that people who experience the anticipatory grief experience less grief after the death. But that's not true for everybody. Grief is as unique as our fingerprint, and there's no right or wrong way, as Holly said, to do it. It's so important to acknowledge what you're feeling and allow yourself to see what's underneath those feelings. In the booklet that you all have, it gives you some ideas about dealing with anticipatory grief. So the first one is taking breaks, and Holly was talking about that in terms of spending time with the person who's dying. It is exhausting, right? You're not sure what's going to happen with them. You're caregiving. You're worried about every movement, every moment. Is this going to be the last? It can really be hard on us. So take breaks. You need that time away. And as the person who is dying needs someone like that. Ask for help. This is a time when you really want to get supportive community and have their help. Because as Holly said, hospice isn't 24 hours a day. So you need a community, a tribe.
And sometimes, yeah, I mean, I've been with families where I'm answering the phone, I'm answering the door, taking all the casseroles and, finding a place for them. And it's okay to ask for help, and it's okay to seek help. Like, you don't have to do it all. And and just making sure that you're taking care of yourself by asking for help.
Yeah. You want to monitor your expectations. I get caught up in expectations, right? Yeah. My expectations, everyone else's expectations of me, my expectations of them. We can get really caught up in that, and we might expect the dying person to say they're sorry and to say I love you and all those important things, but that might not be what they're experiencing. I know I have companioned people after deaths, and so often there are regrets. I wish I had done this. I wish I had said this. So that's one of the reasons I encourage these conversations, because I also hear people say, my loved one wanted to be at home and I got him home. And that gives them such comfort. I also want to say, however, that I don't think it's ever too late. I often encourage people to write letters to their loved ones after they've died and say whatever they need to say. I worked with a woman one time who lost her husband, and her granddaughter purchased a big teddy bear for her. And she put that in her living room. And at the end of every day, she came home and had a conversation with that teddy bear like it was her husband. And that brought her comfort. And everybody ended up finding out about it, and she ended up with thousands, hundreds of teddy bears. But it's never too late, in my mind, to have those conversations. And it's anticipating death. We're not going to be ourselves either, right? So, we're all human. We're never going to do everything as we look back and say, gosh, I did that perfectly. We're all going to have regrets, and have safe spaces where you can share those regrets. I was with a group of women who had lost their spouses, and they were just taking the opportunity to share some of the regrets they had for the final moments. I wish I had done that. I wish I had done that. And one of the women ended up writing a letter to her husband saying those things. And she said it was so healing. And I said, in what way? And she said, because I realized it's not as big a deal as I was making it. I know he knows, that I love him. The other thing you can do is write a letter that you think your loved one would say back to you. Mm-hmm. And that can often help reframe things to give you some peace. So it's never too late to have those conversations.
And then everybody grieves a little differently too, because like for my personal experience, I'm the oldest of 6. So when my dad died, the children, my siblings, we all grieved differently. We all had a different relationship with him. Me being the oldest and compared to my sister being the youngest, there was different. I was older and she was much younger. And so now after I got into this role and started doing more of it, I've been reflecting back on those moments. And there were some people, because I'll say it, like, I didn't cry. What was wrong with Holly? She wasn't shedding a tear. She wasn't crying. She must need therapy. She's not handling it. She's in denial. My role in the whole household situation was the oldest child. I had to rally them all up. Like, I didn't have a moment to show like my grief because everybody was leaning on me. My youngest sister's 13 years younger. Like, did I have my moments? Absolutely. But I didn't have it where other people saw it, or a select few. So if you don't see people like grieving or the way that you think they should, doesn't mean that they're not. And, be careful to not judge and be, harsh or things, because, you just don't know what they're going through. Yeah. Because, yes, I was told that I needed to seek a counselor, and I'm like, oh boy, no way. Like, I do need that. I got to keep everything together. Like, I had time to do that. There was no time to do that. I had responsibilities.
And seeking professional help is good too, mm-hmm. Right?
Yeah, and there's like a time and a place for it. Did I seek help later? Yes, but not when everybody else thought I needed it. It came later, because with me, it came like that rush. It was like almost a tsunami like feature when I always look at the waves because I like the beach. So my grief was much like a tsunami. Like, everything went out and it was so calm for, a couple weeks. And then all of a sudden that wave came crashing in, and it was like 20 feet high. And I was like, where in the world did that come from? And then that's when it happened for me. So knowing, when is a good time. And then also when you talk with a therapist and things, it's okay to interview them too. Like they're not always going to be, the first one may not always be the right fit. And that's okay too. Research them, interview them, find one that you connect well with, because it's intimate and it can bring up a lot of feelings. So you definitely want to make sure you're comfortable with that person.
Oh, yeah. Because grief is messy.
Isn't it though? Yes. It is very messy.
It's up and down and all around, and has so many different emotions and different experiences. We talk about it being an emotion, emotion, energy we need to move from the inside to the outside. And there's many ways to do that, as there are people experiencing grief. And we all experience grief. There's a Buddhist tale where a woman had a child and lost her husband. And the child really helped her through that grief. And then she lost her child. And she took the child to the Buddha and said, "Can you please bring my child back to life?" And the Buddha said, "Yes, if you get me a mustard seed from a home that has not experienced a loss, I will bring your child back to life." And so she went from home to home to home and couldn't find anyone who hadn't experienced loss. And it taught her that there was this community that supported her. In our culture, it feels as if we're told when we're grieving, "I'm sorry for your loss, go over to that corner and grieve, and then when you're ready, come back and join us, and don't take very long." We don't do a really good job. We used to wear black, right? We used to wear black armbands, and people would know we lost someone, and they'd come up to us and say, "I see you lost someone. Tell me about them." And that's one of the ways we heal, is by remembering and remembering ourselves. I was at a training one time with Alan Wolfelt, who's done a lot on grief and loss. And a woman there shared a story that her family experienced a horrific car accident, and one family member died and one was gravely injured. Her daughter said to her, "We need to mark our house somehow. We used to put crepe bunting on our homes to let people know." So they got a flag, a dark flag, that for them represented how they were different. And a couple days later, a neighbor drove up the family's driveway, came to the front door. The woman answered the door, and the neighbor looked at her and said, "When are you going to take down that flag? It's depressing the rest of us." So it's not always very comfortable sharing our grief, and that's part of the work that we do, is creating safe spaces where you can talk about it. So much happens when we can share our story and it's witnessed compassionately. It really helps us to heal. So acknowledging, that's the last step there. Give yourself permission to feel all of your feelings. That's on page 3 of your booklet, because there are so many. Oftentimes there's relief. As we talk about anticipatory grief, we're anticipating the loss, and then there's relief at the loss, and we feel guilty that we feel relief, but that's normal. We don't want to see our loved ones suffer. It's a lot of around the clock work for us in some cases. It's normal to feel that relief. So it becomes a problem when you're feeling these things if you get stuck. If you can't see any color in the day. There are 3 models now of grief that I really appreciate. One is dual process, which means that some of the time you'll be in loss mode and some of the time you'll be in restoration mode, and you'll just kind of go back and forth. It's like young kids, right? They come running to you with a concern, and then they're off having fun, and then they come back. That's what it's like, and you don't know when it's going to happen. So many times I've heard stories of people being in the grocery store, and then they see an item of their loved ones, and they just have to leave their cart and walk out of the store because a grief burst just overwhelms them. So that's a part of what it's like. And it's important to allow yourself to feel all of those pieces and know that there's not a right or wrong way to do it. A second model of grief is continuing bonds. Our culture, again, is not as good at continuing to have some kind of a relationship with our loved ones. Other cultures do, right? We've got Dia de los Muertos, people talking about ancestors. Thankfully, this theory is becoming more and more popular now in our culture, so that it's okay, in fact, healthy, to continue to have some kind of relationship with our loved ones. And then the third model is narrative, which is about finding ways to move our grief, move it from the inside to the outside. It can be through talking, through crying, through creating art. There's so many different ways to move our grief. And you come out a different person than when you came in. Often, all the time, I would say, people would much rather have their loved ones back than to have been transformed by the experience. But at minimum, they feel more compassion because they get it. They understand what it's like to feel loss. I was with the support group one time, and we asked them who was most helpful to them on their grief journeys, and everyone said someone who had experienced a significant loss themselves. Unless you have, it's really hard to know what it's like. And people have good intentions. They want to be supportive. But there's a rule of thirds. A third of the people you know are helpful. A third are indifferent. And a third can be toxic. And it's often not who you think is going to be in the category that they are.
What about the 3 H's?
Oh,
Yeah.
Doug Manning has written a lot about grief and loss. Talks about the 3 H's: hugs, hang around, and hush. So hugs, people need our compassion and our love. Hang around, be present, just be there. And hush, you don't have to say anything. Oftentimes words aren't helpful, right? Just presence. My husband's sister, so my sister-in-law, died in July, and she had cancer, so she asked us to journey with her in her final weeks. And one day we went over to see her and took her outside in the backyard, and the 3 of us sat out there, and we took our shoes off and had our feet on the grass, and we were there for about 2 hours, and I think maybe 10 words were spoken the whole time. And it was as if anything needed to be said, it didn't need to be said anymore.
And there's a lot to that, because I was with a family once as well, and they asked me to come, and I was there, and the person had passed, and everybody, was standing up, and they thanked me and they hugged me, and they couldn't have done it without me. And then I realized I didn't say anything that whole entire time. Just the presence, like they didn't want to be alone, and just the moment of just the stillness. And sometimes there doesn't need to be anything that needs to be said, but without even talking, there was so much that was said. And so that, again, I always have these moments and just kind of keep building upon the work that I do, which is like a calling, because it just kind of all keeps piecing together. So I often take that back. Like sometimes people want to talk a lot. Sometimes you don't have to talk a lot, or you shouldn't. And I will say, like, the one thing you can say is, I know how you feel. Never say that, because even if you think you do, you don't. Even if I lost my dad, you lost your dad, I can't come up to you and say, I know how you feel. It was a different relationship. Everything is completely, You don't say anything about that. It's not about an I statement. It's not about you. It's don't say that. Just hug. If you don't have words, hug. If that person's not a hugger, the hush. Just stand alongside of them.
Talking about grief companioning.
Yeah.
And that's walking alongside. It's not directing, because we can't fix it for the other. So in a lot of ways, that takes the pressure off of us.
Mm-hmm.
We can't show them the way out. They're the only ones who can find that for themselves. There's a beautiful story of a woman who lost a child, and someone said, "How did you make it through?" She said, "A pinky saved me."
Yeah.
And she explained that she had a friend who would come to be with her every day, and they would go for a walk and they would touch pinkies. And that's what helped her through, just knowing that there was somebody else there who was present to her, and she could say what she needed to. We want to fix it, we want to take it away, but there's no way we can do that. So anticipatory grief is a lot like regular grief. And in the book that we give you some ideas of how to open to grief. Opening feels hard, right? When we're grieving, I feel almost like I want to curl up in the fetal position. But we're inviting you to open to it. Allow yourself to experience all that it is. And you meet it as a companion. I worked with a gentleman who would say, I can see grief over there in the corner. I'm going to let it sit with me on the couch now for a little while. And grief and loss happens every day. We're talking a lot about death here, but it happens every day. When we say goodbye to this day, about 20 years ago now, I had these spots on my nose, and I went to the doctor, not here, we weren't living here, and they said, it's this little bacterial infection. They gave me a cream. And so I ignored it for it would come and go, next 10 or 15 years. Finally went to a dermatologist, and it was basal cell carcinoma, and it had grown so much at that time that they had to take cartilage from my ear and a flap of skin from my cheek and move it over to my nose. So I was behind bandages. I looked like an alien for about 6 weeks, and I was behind bandages. And I went to the doctor. She took off the bandage, took out the final stitches, and said, "Okay, you're good to go." And I thought, no, I'm not. My face is swollen. It's red. I was more comfortable behind the bandages than I was the way I looked at that point. And that night, my husband and I were taking dinner to our daughter. She was working at Welsh Pool at the time. And we got to the pool, and I had the food in my lap, and I couldn't get out of the car. I couldn't go walk in front of all those people. So he took her dinner, and we went home, and I was upset, and I went up to our bedroom, and my favorite spot where I can look at the mountain range. And our son came into the room, and he said, "Will you drive me to swim practice tonight?" And I said, "Sure." So I was driving him to swim practice, and he said, "You know why I asked you to drive me?" And I said, "Why?" He said, "Because I wanted to talk to you. You're grieving now." And that's a good thing, because now you're going to understand it even more to do the work that you do. So I really paid attention to that. My body was healing. How does that compare to how my heart heals, right, after a loss? And there are a lot of similarities. I mean, our bodies know how to do it, right? Some of you could explain how we heal from the inside out from a wound. I don't know. It just heals, right? We have to take care of ourselves, and you have to do that in grief. Out of nowhere, I would get pain as the nerves were being regenerated, right? And that's like the grief bursts that come along. It's something that I had to keep going back, for about a year to get more treatments to get rid of the scarring and things. And we can keep reaching out for help when we're going through grief and loss. And then there are scars. We're never the same after having a loss. And that's the same with our body. So being gentle with ourselves, kind to ourselves, taking care of ourselves, letting our bodies do what they need to do, and beginning with kindness. Gratitude is huge. I just got a gift today that I'm grateful for, a stone that says gratitude from Holly. Gratitude is so important, and having a gratitude practice can help us on our grief journeys. Mindfulness and meditation. It's so important that we take the time to be present. It's like a muscle. And the more we practice that, the more we can return to that when we need to do so. Restoring in nature. Nature is so healing. It can show us so much, right? We go out there and we see life and death all the time. We see new life. This is the time of year. We just are seeing all the colors. We came from a time of winter, often likened to grief, and now all the colors. So it gives us hope that we too will experience regrowth. Joining together, coming together, having safe places, making art, writing, journaling is a great way to move our grief. You don't have to write for somebody else. I know people who have journals, and they have one person in their life that they've told, if anything ever happens to me, go into my home, get these journals and burn them. I don't want anybody else to see them. And because you don't have to do it for somebody else. Just have a way that you can, there's something that happens between our head and our hand when we're writing on paper. And welcoming the life that's yours. Being open to what we've been given and finding how it belongs as well.
Yeah, we've been talking a lot about like anticipatory grief regarding death, but there's other forms of grief. For example, I'm seeing a lot with like a dementia diagnosis. That loved one, the person that has that dementia diagnosis, which is a disease of the brain where they become forgetful, and they're really not responding anymore. They're still there, they're physically there, but the loved ones that are around them are grieving the loss. You're not having conversations with that person. That person can't recall memories. Sometimes they don't even remember they're married. I have a client in a facility that the husband has his wife in a facility, and she actually doesn't realize she's married anymore and has a boyfriend in the facility. And that's anticipatory grief. That's grief all over because, she's still here and he's grieving the loss of his wife because he goes to visit and she has nothing to do with him. So he's not visiting anymore. It's too hard for him to visit, but she's still here. Like, how do you do that? How do you process that? Grief of a divorce, a life that you thought you were going to have, plans, that's grief. When your children grow up and they move out, that's exciting, but it's also grief. Wow, like what's happening? And just, like as we age and things and the grief. And I wanted to circle back around too, when you say grief has a timing, because you think about it, like even with work, it's like, oh, if it's an immediate family member, it's 3 days you can grieve. If it's a second family member, an aunt or an uncle, then you can have 1 day, but then you can come back to work. And I often come back to that. It's like, okay, so yeah, when you talk about having a timeline, there's not a timeline to it. And when we work, we all have so many different stories because we all are, everybody, you're grieving something. It doesn't necessarily have to be a death grief, but just as you age and things change, my oldest turned 21 and he's kind of grieving his childhood. He's like, wow, Mom, this adulting isn't as fun as I thought it would be. So, and he was talking to his younger brother last night. He's like, you need to enjoy this. It only gets more complicated. And I'm sitting there, I'm like, you just turned 21. How is this so much more complicated? But he's giving him all these well, when I was your age, I wish I would have done that. I'm like, that's 2 years ago. Okay. But it was so much fun listening to them reminisce and having, it was just fun to, so yeah, be cautious, conscientious of the different types of grief that are out there. we're filming here, like we're in central Pennsylvania. So those of you online or might watch later, you might not be in central Pennsylvania, but like we grieve sunshine because sometimes we don't have it for a few days or months, and it gets cold and people get depressed and grieve. You know what we could do, we're not outside as much, there's no sunshine, so you have to be aware of our environment too. It causes grief.
Although for the first time today, someone told me they lived in California for 30 years and they missed clouds. They love to see the clouds. I thought, wow.
So there you go, there's
Yeah.
a good example.
Right,
Yeah, like yeah, you grieve all sorts of things if you don't have it.
right.
You tend to, if that's what you've known, you tend to grieve at some point.
So we have a few minutes before the 1 hour. Are there, question?
Yeah, so I was reading through the book here, and there's a passage that I think might really resonate with other people who might be listening. And it talks about being a caregiver and feeling a sense of relief when that person that you're caregiving for passes away, and kind of what that process is from your guys' standpoint to kind of walk through with that with someone who might be feeling that relief, but then feeling guilty for feeling that relief, and how you guys walk someone through that, what that's like.
It's
I don't know if you want to repeat the question a little bit in case they
Thank
couldn't
you.
hear. Sure.
the comment was about, in the booklet, it says being a caregiver, oftentimes you do feel some relief when your loved one dies because, you know, you don't have to do all that caregiving and also the suffering that your loved one went through. It's so important to just give people spaces so they can say these things. I feel guilty. They might not be rational thoughts, right? I just wrote an article about bereaved Mother's Day and how many women who lose babies feel guilt, and there was nothing they could have done. You know, we feel guilt for feeling relief. It might not be rational, but giving people a space to say that helps them to heal it. They need to be able to acknowledge it, and then that sort of begins their way through it. Is there more you want to say about that?
No, and that's exactly it. And it's, especially if you're a caregiver, I mean, you're tired, and maybe I see this a lot where the caregiver themselves neglect their health, and then they start to decline because they're so busy being a caregiver. Then they're not taking care of themselves. And then sometimes, then that's when a big crisis happens, because what happens to the caregiver? If they get sick, they end up in a hospital, they get ill, who's going to take care of their loved one? And then that creates stress for them. And even like family and children watching it, you know, as children, you can only do so much for your parents. And when you see the one that's, you know, declining or has a disease or a diagnosis, and your other parent caring for them, sometimes there is a bit of relief, because like, you know that there's not a cure, they're not going to get better, so just please let this end, so, you know, my other parent can, you know, have a break or live. And yeah, and that's something that, you know, we see a lot of, is just that guilt, and back to like not judging. And the one thing I always like when somebody says, or a child comes in, or whoever says to the caregiver, you need to take care of yourself. I think they know that, but suggestions, like how do they do that? You know, I see it all the time. Sometimes you can't, and you just do the best that you can given your situation. I think that's where a lot of the relief comes in, because yeah, a lot of times they know what they need to do, but how can they do it? I mean, things are expensive now. Let's talk about the shortage of everywhere. Everybody's short staffed, so you can't just get caregivers to come into a home anymore. You know, states have different programs. Pennsylvania has a waiver program. Yeah, it's great. You qualify, but there's no caregivers to come in. You qualify, you can get some help. There's no caregivers to help. So what do? They do the best that they can in the situation that they're given. And yeah, sometimes it's not what I would do, but again, it's not me, but they're okay. They're okay. Yeah. So
And it's forgiving ourselves,
Yes.
right? We're imperfect.
Exactly.
And I was with one group where a woman said, I asked myself, does this thought serve me well? And if it doesn't, then she tries to little by little release it. We often talk about rituals you can do to help remind yourself, you decide, all right, I want to release this. I don't want to hold this unforgiveness with myself. And so when you walk through the door, you say, okay, remember, I'm going to release this. So just do different things like that to remind yourself and just keep doing it over and over again. But it's hard work. We're hard on ourselves.
And I use I visualize with people, and I tell them, because this is what I have done at times too, where I'm carrying luggage around. And like when I'm out here today, it's my luggage, this is like everything that I'm thinking about. But when I go see a client or I'm talking to somebody, I actually take a moment before I step in to see them into their house, and I pause at the door and I drop my luggage outside. And I take a deep breath and I step in, and then I reach down and I pick up their luggage. So now it's about them, and I have to keep it separate. So my stuff is outside and it's all about them. And then when I leave, once again, as a nurse and an advocate, it's hard, but I have to stop, drop their luggage, step across, and now it's back to mine, because you can't carry it all. And you have to, and self-care, which is a whole nother topic that we could talk about for days and days. But yeah, our time is up. Any other questions, comments? It's always fun being with you. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
for having
everyone.
us.
I would love to applaud both of you. I thought you did a great job, and I certainly learned some things. So thank you so much, and we'll, for our audience, hope to see you next month, where the topic will be about dementia. Always I won't say popular, but
Much needed,
much
important
needed topic.
conversation. Yes.
Thank you.